Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for taking time out from hurricane recovery and your busy days, and voting, of course, to come see us. On the behalf of CERES and the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies and the Project for Jewish Civilization, welcome to today's talk by Natalie Belsky, entitled Encounters in the East, Evacuees in the Soviet Hinterland during the Second World War. Natalie is a Ph.D. candidate at the University of Chicago and is currently a visiting fellow at the Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies at that's at the Holocaust Museum. Okay. Her research interests include Soviet history, modern Jewish history, and migration and displacement studies. And today's talk will address the experience of millions of Soviet civilians who were evacuated in the wake of the Nazi invasion of the USSR in 1941. They spent the war years in Soviet Central Asia, Siberia, the Urals, and the Volga regions. And the talk will explore the complex and problematic interactions and relationships that developed between the evacuees and the local residents. It will examine the repercussions of mass population displacement in the Soviet Union and the ways in which the evacuation experience revealed divisions and hierarchies in Soviet society, and also questioned the very meaning of Soviet identity. For Soviet Jews, who formed a significant constituency of the evacuated population, their experience at sites of resettlement proved particularly troubling, as they witnessed a rise in anti-Semitism. So welcome, Natalie, and thank you for coming.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thanks to Ben and to the Center for Eurasian, Russian, East European Studies for inviting me to come today and then rescheduling when Sandy seemed to deter us. I'd like to also say that this presentation and the research for my work was made possible thanks to my tenure as a Sosna Foundation Fellow at the Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and thanks to generous funding from the American Council's Research Scholar Program. So without further ado, in the wake of the Nazi invasion of June 1941, the Soviet Union launched an evacuation effort targeting factories and plants, as well as important administrative institutions. Understandably, the goal of the state-sponsored evacuation initiative was to get the most important industrial facilities, like defense plants and the elite members of Soviet society, like writers and scientists and high-ranking government officials, out of the range of the Nazi occupiers. At the same time, millions of people simply fled east in the wake of the assault. Most would endure harrowing journeys in cattle cars lasting weeks and even months, crowded into small spaces with other families and trading the limited articles they had packed for food along the way as they traversed vast expanses of space, often not knowing even the destination of the train. Many evacuees thought that they were leaving only for a few weeks until the Red Army pushed the Germans back and took only a few things with them. Instead, they would be gone for over a year, generally 2 to 3 years, and many would come back to find their homes, towns, cities, and communities destroyed, and their relatives and friends perished. While there had been anticipation of war in the Soviet Union throughout the 1930s, it was assumed that the Red Army would be on the offensive, not the defensive, and that a future war would take place on foreign territory. As a result, the Soviet government did not foresee having to evacuate its citizens, and there were no plans or preparations for such an exigency. Actually, the story runs that they ran to the archives after the invasion to look for what had been done during the First World War, what kind of evacuation plans had existed then. Consequently, the evacuation effort was poorly organized and often chaotic. People camped out in front of train stations on both ends of the journey. Trains often did not even have a fixed destination and were simply sent to the depths of the country. Given the size of the Soviet Union, this could mean a myriad of possible destinations. Evacuees were resettled, as Ben mentioned in the introduction, in a vast and diverse geography. In the Volga River Basin, the Ural Mountains, Siberia, Central Asia, and Kazakhstan, which meant that evacuees found themselves thousands of miles away from their homes in regions which bore little resemblance to their hometowns and communities. Evacuees would spend 2 to 3 years at sites of resettlement where they had to adapt to unfamiliar living circumstances, environments, and lifestyles and make do with very scarce resources. Throughout the war, Soviet officials had a very difficult time ascertaining the size and demographics of the evacuee population. Scholarly estimates of the Soviet evacuee population that have come out throughout the years range anywhere from 6 to 25 million. A recent excellent study of the evacuation experience, really the first comprehensive study by Western historians, by historian Rebecca Manley, gives an estimate of about 16.5 million, but that number has been contested. The truth of the matter is that it is extraordinarily difficult to establish an accurate number of Soviet evacuees, though records were certainly kept. On the one hand, the chaotic nature of the operation hampered efforts to keep track of people. Secondly, it's very hard to keep track of moving target, for evacuees continuously move from place to place, looking for better living circumstances. And in fact, there are documents in which Soviet statisticians and officials themselves write, we have records on 6 million people, but we know there are more than 10. So they themselves, during the war, were very much aware of the fact that they had very little accurate information on this population. While we lack exact figures, what is clear is that the Soviet evacuation constitutes an instance of mass population displacement. Moreover, it is certain that a very significant proportion of East European Jewry who survived the Holocaust did so in evacuation in the hinterland of the Soviet Union. Though again, numbers are difficult to establish, estimates indicate that there were 1 million Soviet Jews among the evacuee population, which would certainly indicate that Jews were overrepresented among the evacuees in comparison with their proportion among the Soviet population in general. In addition to the 1 million Soviet evacuees, there are also estimates of several hundred thousand Polish Jewish refugees that ended up in the Soviet Union during the war as well. Many from the annexed areas of Poland that were annexed to the Soviet Union in 1939. There are several reasons for the overrepresentation of Jews among the evacuee population. The regions of the Soviet Union from where evacuation took place, Ukraine, Belarus, and the Western Russian Soviet Federative Republic, were the areas where most Soviet Jews resided. Evacuation efforts largely targeted urban areas, and again, the Jewish population tended to be urban. Lastly, some Jews were more motivated to evacuate than their non-Jewish neighbors because of their fear of Nazi anti-Semitism. However, this is not a given. Tragically, many Soviet Jews refused to believe rumors about Nazi anti-Jewish policies and preferred to stay put, as they harbored very legitimate fears about the dangers inherent in evacuation, picking up your family and going to an unknown destination, especially during wartime, is obviously a dangerous proposition. In oral testimonies with Ukrainian Jews that are available at the Holocaust Museum archive, but were acquired from the Judaica Institute in Kiev, the same story comes up again and again in the testimonies. In every family, there seems to have been relatives who remembered the German occupiers from the First World War relatively favorably. They refused to believe Soviet propaganda claims about the Nazis, very legitimately, because many Soviet propaganda claims were not in fact true, and were determined to stay put, encouraging other family members to follow suit. So often, for many families, are very much divided. One section of the family left, the others stayed behind. In order to get a better sense of what was going on an individual level, I'd like to introduce you to the story of Abraham Zeitlin, whose unpublished memoir I located at the Holocaust Museum archive, and again originates from the collection at the Judaica Institute in Kiev. Zeitlin's story of evacuation and survival in Central Asia illustrates the challenges, discoveries, and encounters that evacuees experienced over the course of their displacement. In 1941, Abraham was a 9-year-old boy living in Ilyince, a Jewish shtetl near Vinnytsia in central Ukraine, where his father worked as a local photographer. On June 22nd, Abraham and his mother returned from their trip to the river to find his father and his friends deep in discussion at the dining room table over the news of the German invasion, debating what to do next. They could not believe that the Soviet Union had been caught off guard, and some felt it was best to stay put, confident that the Red Army would push the Nazis back in no time. Others were adamant that they must leave immediately. While Zeitlin's father agonized over the decision, Abraham and his friends had free rein to play and do as they will, for their parents had more important things to worry about. At that point, for them, war just seemed like a game. As Zeitlin wrote decades later, and here I'll quote him, In those first days of the war, no one knew yet, nor could they know, the true cost of such a mistake regarding to go or not to go. They did not know and could not know what a terrible fate was in store for those who remained in the shtetl occupied by the Germans. They did not know and could not know what sufferings would fall upon those who decided to evacuate. Saintland's father made up his mind to evacuate after refugees from Poland and retreating soldiers passed through the village, bearing bad tidings about what was going on at the front. Still, he was sure that they would return home within a few weeks' time. Instead, they spent weeks moving east in a freight train under constant threat of Nazi aerial bombings. On one occasion, the train stopped, and everyone was ordered to abandon the cars and hide in the surrounding fields. And this kind of story is reiterated in many accounts. The family disembarked close to the city of Voronezh by the eastern Ukrainian border with Russia, where Saintland's father hoped they would be safe from the Nazi onslaught. They were taken in by a pleasant local woman who had never encountered Jews before in her life and was shocked that they seemed to be people just like herself. This is by no means a singular example. A few testimonies indicate the local residents in the Russian interior, who had had no interactions with Jews before, asked the newcomers where their horns were, adamant that all Jews indeed had horns. The Saintland family were not to remain there outside of Voronezh long. As the front drew closer, they were first to move further east, and eventually ended up in Kermeny, which is in Uzbekistan. Saintland's description of Kermeny indicates how different and exotic he and many other evacuees found their new surroundings. Here in Kermeny, everything was unusual. The language in which the local residents communicated with one another, the scorching sun, the clay homes and fences, the colorful market, fruits I had never seen before, Uzbeks dressed at any time of the year in warm robes, belted with kerchiefs, irrigation ditches, massive shady sycamore trees, donkeys in almost every yard, proclaiming with their ya, ya, ya to all the surroundings. Caravans of camels loaded with bales of cotton, mountains of snow-white cotton, clay bricks on the territory of the cotton processing plant, emitting night and day a dull rumble. Lizards, snakes, big grasshoppers with wings of all the colors of the rainbow. Just a few sentences from his description of Kermeny. The sounds, the sights, the sounds, the people, the language, the culture, and lifestyles, all was unfamiliar and different. When I first came upon this memoir, I was fascinated with Saintland's account. On the one hand, his family experienced great hardship and deprivation, yet on the other, they also got a glimpse of an entirely different society and way of living, despite the fact that they had never crossed international borders and remained within the Soviet Union for the duration of the war. In fact, it was strikingly similar to my own grandfather's story, a Jewish boy from Leningrad who loved playing the violin. He was evacuated with his school and spent the war years in a village where he lived with a peasant family and worked as the horse caretaker. His wartime odyssey, like Saintland's, amazed me because it seemed to be such a disjuncture from his pre- and post-war experience that I wondered about the impact it had on him and those of his generation. Thus, my project examines the way in which individuals confronted the places to which they were sent and the peoples who lived there, how they were received and treated by local authorities and local populations, and how they themselves understood their plight and the survival adaptation strategies they employed. How did these diverse groups of people coexist? How were communities transformed as a result of the influx of evacuees? And lastly, how did the evacuation experience impact the outlooks and mentalities of Soviet citizens? As I delved into archival materials, I discovered that evacuee life and survival in the East was determined by complex encounters, interactions, and entanglements between and among evacuees themselves and with local residents at sites of resettlement. These took place on many different levels and in distinct sites. Indeed, as both archival and testimonial sources attest, evacuees did not live in the proverbial bubble, simply because they could not. They encountered local residents at work, at the market, and perhaps most inescapably at home. Let's just list the main spheres, what I've identified as the main spheres of encounter in daily life interaction. Due to housing shortages, evacuees were usually housed with local residents. Oftentimes, these relationships were fraught with tension, as locals resented having to give up scant space in their homes to those who they perceived as outsiders. Many took steps to encourage evacuees to leave. In some cases, evacuees were forcibly evicted outright. This attitude was particularly noticeable among local residents who had actually been exiled to these peripheral areas during the Stalinist deportations and purges of the 1930s, and harbored much ill will to Soviet power and anyone who they felt represented it in any way. All the same, securing a stable living situation depended on the ability of evacuees and local residents to come to some sort of agreement. Often this meant that locals demanded that evacuees pay extremely high rent prices. However, in other cases, more creative exchanges were arranged. According to one oral history, yet again from the Ukrainian collection, the local farmer who received a family from Kiev was happy to have them because she valued the cooking abilities of the evacuee. They set up an arrangement in which the local woman provided the evacuee with the produce necessary in exchange for her cooking services. Moreover, evacuees and locals worked together, with evacuees often assuming key positions in collective farms and local organizations. At the same time, hiring decisions were also fraught with problems, as many local authorities questioned whether evacuees were trustworthy and reliable, and often preferred to hire locals over the newcomers. As Zeitlin's account indicates, evacuees and locals came from very different types of communities and backgrounds. In general terms, evacuees, and of course it doesn't apply to everyone, but evacuees tended to come from cities in the more developed western areas of the Soviet Union, while the local residents they encountered were often rural residents with much less developed and peripheral parts of the country. This enabled the emergence of an us versus them mentality. Another important arena for exchange and collaboration was the cultural and scientific sphere. Many evacuated artists, performers, writers, and scientists continued to work in their fields of expertise, helping develop and enrich local institutions and mentoring local workers. Many theaters and the ballets were evacuated to these areas, and there they kind of continued their work. And this also happened with the Academy of Sciences. And in fact, there's no better illustration of the interdependencies among evacuees and locals in the Soviet hinterland than the black market. As countless testimonies, memoirs, and official documents assert, in light of wartime scarcities, the Soviet economy devolved into a barter system, and money became practically valueless. Evacuees' valuables and clothing became their lifelines, which they were able to exchange for food products. In fact, it seems that a new kind of price measurements evolved, as local farmers refused to sell their products for cash and only accepted manufactured goods in exchange. For example, one report indicated that a pumpkin would cost a pair of pants. One particularly poignant example is the popularity of evacuees' nightgowns amid local residents who used them as ball gowns for formal occasions. This example demonstrates the kind of exchanges that took place, but also points to the socioeconomic and cultural differences that separate evacuees and local residents. Returning to Zeitlin's story, in Kermine, Zeitlin's family befriended their Tatar neighbors, who were instrumental in helping them adjust to their new surroundings and settle in, thus indicating the ways in which evacuees depended on friendly contacts with local residents. Zeitlin also describes the market as one of, if not the most important place in town, certainly one of the most important, where everyone converged and all kinds of goods and information were exchanged. Zeitlin's narrative indicates the way in which his family's experience in Uzbekistan was shaped by the constant interactions and contact with local residents. While some proved to be mutually beneficial, others demonstrated the ways in which evacuees, as uninvited newcomers to the community, were scapegoated, and, in the case of Jewish evacuees in particular, discriminated against. The winter of 1941 to 1942 proved to be an especially cold one, and some of the locals in Kermine accused the evacuees of being the cause of this. In school, Abram was initially mocked by the other students in his class for his typical Jewish accent, and nicknamed Burgun for his supposedly crooked nose. At the same time, once Abram proved himself in a fight with one of his classmates, he was accepted into the group and respected by the other boys in the class. Despite the fact that both evacuees and local residents were Soviet citizens, these incidents highlight the ways in which differences of background and culture heightened tensions between them. Zeitlin later describes a pogrom that he felt occurred largely targeting Polish Jewish refugees who had arrived in Kermine and had become very active on the local market. Now I'd like to discuss some of the key categories that informed and defined these interactions and encounters. So So in order to understand the roots of these conflicts between evacuees and local residents, it's important to consider the following questions. How did evacuees identify themselves, and how did they perceive the local populations they came into contact with? How were they viewed both by local residents and local populations? In other words, what biases and prejudices were at the root of these tensions? I've already mentioned some of them, but initially I had assumed that ethnic identity was the key identifier and the key factor in processes of group formation and differentiation. In fact, given the rise of anti-Semitism, this certainly became an important factor. In one case, Jewish families in a collective farm in Kazakhstan were forcibly evicted by a mob organized by the collective farm chairman. In this instance, Jewish evacuees were clearly demarcated from others by ethnicity and labeled as unwanted and dangerous. However, my research led me to find that other categories were also very important. Class and regional considerations played a key role in determining these relationships. As I mentioned, the evacuees came from other more developed and wealthier areas, central and western areas of the Soviet Union. Many were well educated, or at the very least literate urbanites. They were often bewildered at the living conditions and lifestyles in the more underdeveloped regions of the Soviet Union, and saw the locals as uncultured. Locals, on the other hand, perceived evacuees as spoiled, privileged city dwellers who expected to be provided for and live off of the local community, thus presenting an additional burden on already strained local economies. In a myriad of ways, evacuees and locals came from different social, cultural, and economic milieus. In many cases, it was these differences, rather than ethnicity or nationality, that drove a wedge between the two groups and made regional understanding extremely difficult. Moreover, many evacuees and refugees identified themselves not so much by class or ethnicity as by locality, as Muscovites or Leningraders, for example, and tended to associate with others who came from the same areas. In an oral history collected by the Judaica Institute and acquired by the Holocaust Museum, a Jewish evacuee from Odessa recounted that in Karakorum, during the war, even a stranger, if he's from Odessa, always seems to be a close relative. Far away from the homes and the cities that they loved, evacuees understandably clung to those with whom they had something in common and with whom they could share fond memories of homes now under enemy occupation. Regional identity also, of course, colored the perceptions of local residents who privileged their own people over the newcomers. Lastly, gendered identities came to play an increasingly important role in the wake of the war. In writing letters of complaint or requests for benefits, many women identified themselves first and foremost as wives or mothers of soldiers, and this became an important new entitlement category for Soviet citizens. Of course, women and children were overrepresented among the evacuee population, naturally, because their male relatives were at the front. Thus, individuals identified with one another based on their common status and shared struggles as spouses of soldiers at the front. Thus, ethnic, class, regional, and gender categories played important roles in shaping these relationships, attitudes, and community life at sites of resettlement. Indeed, the challenge is not in identifying which category is most salient, but in figuring out how to think about the interplay among them. Still, given the size and prominence of the Jewish evacuee population, it is important to consider the ways in which the experience of Jews was distinct from that of non-Jews. The examples I shall provide below will provide now will give some sense of how one kind of difference shaped encounters between the evacuees and locals, and made a significant impact on those involved. Anti-Semitic attitudes seem to have become particularly prevalent at sites of resettlement among youths and children, plaguing the school environment particularly. For some Jewish youths, this was the first moment when they perceived that they were different from others, and so to speak, confronted their Jewish identity. During the 1920s and 30s, the Soviet Union waged a campaign against anti-Semitism, and though prejudice certainly continued to exist, strides were made against expressions of ethnic discrimination, and there was a genuine hope that ethnic difference would cease to matter. During the war, the first signs began to appear that a new wave of anti-Semitism had begun. Before the war, Jewish evacuees had lived in communities where their Jewishness did not attract much attention and did not seem to matter. Thus, in evacuation, children and youth were surprised to discover that they were suddenly viewed as somehow different from everybody else. Maya Goldenberg, an evacuee from Moscow, recounted in her testimony, and here I quote her, "In school for the first time, I felt different from everyone else. I was teased for being Jewish, and not all the children wanted to play with me or be my friends. I do not know how the virus of anti-Semitism made its way to Siberia, because there were very few Jews in Oranienburg. Evidently, it must be a contagious disease of some kind." These children of the war were forced into a rude awakening when they found themselves demarcated from those they identified themselves with, and shunned by those they saw as their peers and equals, for a reason they could neither alter nor hardly understand. In the school in Andijan in Uzbekistan, Gerda Kagan was beaten by one of her classmates for being Jewish. As she recounted, and here I quote her testimony from the Ukrainian project, again from Rich Bake, a student from the Holocaust Museum. Before the war, I did not even understand the difference between a Russian and a Jew. I thought that since I was born in Leningrad, in the territory of the Soviet Union, I'm automatically Russian. When I saw that during Easter everyone had paints except for me, I would complain to my mother, and she would say, "Fine, another time." And all ended with that. No one explained anything to me. At age 11, and here she's referring to her evacuation experience, I decided for myself that I must marry a Russian, so that my kids would not be beaten, so they would not suffer like me. Irina Levkova, an evacuee from Vitebsk, was similarly confounded by the attitudes she confronted among the other children in Yaroslavo. She didn't understand why she was being singled out from the others, and when taunted for being a Jew, she countered by saying that she too was both Russian and Soviet. These youngsters were forced to grapple with an identity that had been thrust upon them for reasons they could not understand, an identity that had not seemed to matter before the war. For those who were somewhat older, this discovery of their difference sometimes made an even more significant impact. A 20-year-old evacuee sent to Kazakhstan was deeply troubled to find that locals were expelling Jewish evacuees from their homes and intentionally not allowing them to use available housing. In a letter to her sister, she described her deep disillusionment and frustration, her sense that her wartime experience came into direct conflict with her pre-war beliefs. She had been schooled in the young communist league and believed in the tenets of Soviet ideology which preached fraternity and equality amongst all Soviet peoples and nations. Thus, for her, the wartime treatment of Jewish evacuees was tantamount to a revocation of the promises that had been made to them by the Soviet state. In her letter, she wrote, and here I quote her, this is from a private document from Kazakhstan. "The Komsomol taught me something very different, that all nations are equal, but here, alas, that is not the case. For 19 years, I was educated in the spirit of love toward the human being. Gorky taught us this when he said with pride, 'The human being, that is magnificent. The human being, that sounds dignified.' For 19 years, I lived by this and believed in it. For 19 years, the words of Gorky and Stalin were sacred for me. But on the 20th year of my life, in this wretched Genevieve, I was convinced of the opposite." In evacuating, she had never left the Soviet Union, yet her experience seemed to indicate that she was no longer in her homeland. In migrating to a place they found so foreign, where they were treated as unwanted outsiders, evacuees came to question the much propagandized ideal about the unity of the Soviet masses and the shared principles and beliefs that bound them together. Of course, it is important to bear in mind that certainly not all Jewish evacuees experienced anti-Semitism during the war, and the incidents I've described constitute just one example of the types of encounters that took place. However, I decided to focus on this issue for several reasons. On the one hand, it reflects the impact of the evacuation experience on a very important segment of Soviet Jewry. Given that most Soviet Jews who survived the war did so as either evacuees or in the Red Army, these youngsters would go on to form the post-war generation of Soviet Jewish youth, in an era which would prove to be a tumultuous one for Soviet Jewry, due to the Soviet anti-Semitic campaigns of the late 1940s and early 50s, and the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. My tentative hypothesis is that for many Jews, evacuation proved to be a significant formative experience that impacted their opinions and points of view in the post-war period. For some, it made them deeply question their belonging in Soviet society and the limits of inclusiveness within the Soviet state. Moreover, I believe that in some ways this phenomenon is indicative not only of the Jewish experience of the evacuation, but also of the impact it had on Soviet evacuees in general. by examining this instance of internal migration, which disturbed the existing social order in the Soviet state, we're able to appreciate the kinds of divisions and fractures that existed among the Soviet population. In Evacuation, individuals were forced to confront unfamiliar environments, unexpected class and ethnic hierarchies, and barriers and prejudicial attitudes that forced them to question the validity of the Soviet ideal and the terms of belonging in their Soviet homeland. These phenomena force us to raise some interesting questions. When we talk about states like the former Soviet Union, which are multi-ethnic and encompass many diverse territories and many diverse ethnicities, where is the border between the foreign and the familiar? What is the real meaning of citizenship in these kinds of communities? And how are the individuals in these kinds of societies bound together? Thank you very much.
Okay. Any questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for the informative and interesting presentation. I have a couple of questions, one on equipment and one on people. To what extent were the Panzer tanks advancing 30, 50 kilometers per day under the Barbarossa operation, to what extent the Soviet government was able to transfer the factories from the west to the east to continue the war effort from the Ural Mountains where all the coal and minerals were able to sustain, the production. The second question about people, mostly about the Jews, why did they end up in Uzbekistan? Why didn't some of them, for example, go to Azerbaijan, which was declared by Stalin as a Jewish colony in the 30s? Why some of them did not go to the big cities, which survived brutal siege, especially Stalingrad and Leningrad? Leningrad survived 900-day siege, millions of victims, but they survived. Why did they have to go all the way to Orenburg, where the Kabristan used to live 100 years or before, whatever, but why didn't they go to the big cities where there are a lot of Jewish communities? And finally, how many of them actually, you mentioned it, enlisted in the Red Army to join the Soviet army, or the partisans, for that matter?
Great, well, thank
I'm
you.
retired from the Foreign Service, by the way, and I served some time in Moscow. So, thank you.
Well, those are some excellent questions, and I will do my best. I'm not sure I have the information to address all of your questions. And I'm not my focus in this project is looking at social history and individual experience. So I don't have the statistics at my fingertips on this. I haven't looked at industrial evacuation in part because it was researched by others. The Soviet, the kind of formal effort of the former state-sanctioned effort of the Soviet Union in evacuation certainly targeted industrial enterprises, and they were able to move many of them, particularly to the eastern areas of the Soviet Union, not so much to Central Asia, I believe, and continued operations there. A lot of publications during the Soviet period on evacuation tended to focus on industrial evacuation and tended to give the story that, the positive story that the Soviet Union did a really great job in moving the industrial facilities. Now, of course, that reflects political biases, and I'm afraid I don't have numbers at my disposal about how many factories and plants were able to get out versus those that were not. Of course, factories and plants that were further to the east had a much better chance of being evacuated rather than facilities that were right on the border. The areas near the border, of course, there was just very little opportunity to get people out. And one reads accounts about kind of how this process often was relatively poorly organized and chaotic. Even in Moscow, there are reports of people coming to work and all of a sudden finding that, in fact, the institution where they worked had actually been evacuated, but they didn't know about it. And things sort of being moved around, and employees constantly being separated from the institutions where they work and having a really hard time finding where those places were. The kind of transportation issue was really a mess. Trains would go to, as I said, didn't really have fixed destinations, and people would end up in a different place than they thought they were going. Trains would separate, get redirected. So, in terms of the question of where did people go, and initially the idea was to move people to the Volga, but individuals kept getting pushed, were pushed back into Central Asia once the German assault proved to be more successful than the Soviets thought it would be. In terms of the kind of the Jewish issue, I do want to make sure I state that the Jews were not evacuated as a national group as such. Like the Soviets would identify, as I said, certain institutions for evacuations, not national groups. This question was a source for some debate in the aftermath of the war, where there was the debate of did the Soviets save the Jews or not save the Jews intentionally or not. That I think it's been made clear recently that that kind of issue certainly wasn't on the agenda to begin with. They were not thinking about are we saving the Jews or are we not saving the Jews. They were thinking that we have to save these particular institutions, and we have to save scientists, for example, who hold a specific importance to the state. So thus, you wouldn't have a train of Jews from shtetls going to Azerbaijan, for example. Azerbaijan was, I think, also out of the question in part because Jews weren't evacuated as a group, but also because it's actually much farther than. So I think that really didn't occur for both of those reasons. That you didn't really have a group of Jews in the kind of a set number of trains, and because no one really wanted to spend the resources to move them that far out. In terms of why they didn't end up in the big cities, they certainly tried to, and many were successful. Tashkent was the huge place where people wanted to go, and there was an excellent book to the Tashkent station on evacuation, specifically to Tashkent. Almaty, the capital of Kazakhstan, was also a big place among other cities. The problem was that these cities could not accommodate the numbers of people that we're talking about. It was extraordinarily difficult to get permission to stay in Tashkent, Almaty, and evacuees spent much ink and paper writing letters saying, well, we really want to be in these cities because that's where we could practice our professions, and that's where we feel like we can get jobs that are in accordance with our skills. But the housing infrastructure was simply not there. Many people who didn't have any kind of connections and weren't, tied to people who could pull strings for them, were unable to get permission to stay in these places. Thus, they were sent out into the rural areas and into the collective farms. Thus, there was really a lot of movement back. The officials kind of trying to get these people to go out to the collective farms, which could accommodate them space-wise and also needed labor because of the mobilization. And then people kind of moving back on their own initiative and continuously trying to get back into the cities, often staying there illegally and so on.
You said it was chaotic, right?
Right. So hence there was a lot of movement, and evacuees were constantly trying to find family members, find places that would be good places to go and try to move there. I think there was one of my favorite documents out of Kazakhstan that kind of was an official report railing against how these evacuees were basically doing the tour de force of Kazakhstan. They would be on trains literally going around a relatively large republic, trying to find where would be a good place to stay. And camping out on railroads and refusing to go out to on railroad stations and refusing to go out to farms where they were sent. But there was really a push and pull with the evacuees. But the other kind of facet that plays into this is that the Soviet authorities themselves weren't quite sure how to deal with this population. Populations they moved before in the 30s were generally those who were deemed that were basically punished groups and were being moved for a punitive reason. This was a different type of population, and they didn't have the same kind of connotation of people being sent to the Gulag. Evacuees enlisted in the Red Army. Again, that has not been a focus of my research. There certainly are testimonies of individuals being evacuated with their families, with men moving with their families, and then enlisting in the places to which they were sent. They were enlisted in the Red Army, not in their home, but from where they had been settled. For many of them, it would be the case that they would enlist at their home and their families would be evacuated. this created, and this, as I said, saw the emergence of this kind of entitlement category of spouses of soldiers who appeal for various benefits based on that identity. But I'm not sure if that addresses all your questions.
Oh, excellent. Thank you very much.
Any other questions?
Do you notice clear differences between sort of organized evacuees versus disorganized ones? So, you know, the ones who were evacuated as part of these critical institutions or critical infrastructure, as opposed to those who are just sort of in every man for himself mode.
Sure. Yeah, and that's a great question. Actually, I had a slide that I got beforehand that was kind of different, that indicated sort of the different groups among the evacuee population. One of them was organized evacuees, and another one was these kind of disorganized populations. I think Rebecca Manley cites it as self-evacuation, individuals who moved on their own. Absolutely, that was definitely part of the case. If you were evacuated with, for those individuals who were evacuated with institutions, if that institution was then kind of reopened at a site of resettlement, you theoretically would have a fixed job, and the other problems that came with having housing, getting a ration card, getting employment would obviously be much easier. A lot of those evacuees that I looked at in situations that I detailed have to do more with kind of this disorganized evacuations of individuals who did not have that solid connection to an institution. But that's a very hard, it actually becomes a very messy differentiation when you look at what's going on the ground, because you know, individuals may have been evacuated as family members of employees of an institution. If their husband may be at the front, and then once they end up at sites of resettlement, they're not really tied to that institution anymore. A lot of times, institution would sort of be liquidated or sort of be done away with at sites of resettlement. So then you didn't have a job anymore because that institution was no longer there. As I said, a lot of evacuees were separated with the putative institution that they were kind of evacuated with. That creates a lot of problems. And as I said, in testimonies, you have a lot of stories of, you know, well, we went with this institution because we had some kind of connection with it, but that, you know, a relative was an employee there or one thing or another. But that might not have guaranteed them employment at that institution once they arrived, wherever they were going. So it was in some cases it certainly was clear cut, but in many cases it was not so clear cut and became rather confusing. And evacuees constantly lobbied for the fact that, well, you know, that they had connections with one institution or another, and that they deserved to go to the place where that institution was or receive benefits as employees of that institution. As I said, women and children made up a large segment of the evacuated population, and that creates a huge amount of challenges because of challenges in terms of working and finding childcare, and women make the case that as wives of servicemen, for example, they deserve to have certain privileges, and they feel like many feel like it's not within their abilities to employment. So I guess the short answer is that in fact, throughout the Soviet period, ties to an institution were always really important, but those kind of ties often do not solve all the problems that we face.
Did you find any accounts of sort of, I guess, secondary or domino evacuees? And what I mean by that is, my stepfather actually wrote a book about, and I know he emailed you, sent it to me, about the evacuation to Kiev of several ministries of Larry Holmes and things like that. So, and the case there was, so Narkam Pros, Narkam Yes, and I think the Ministry of Military Aviation were plopped down in Kiev, and they kicked out the previous occupants of those buildings, which were mostly regional institutions, and sent them out to a village somewhere on the periphery of Advanced Holocaust. And so essentially the people who had been living in Kirov were evacuated within their own region to a village that they maybe had never been to and certainly never wanted to go to. So were there any examples you saw of that, either within the Privolzhia or Uzbekistan or other places like that, where there was sort of a domino effect and certain people were pushed out there?
Yes. No. I mean, there were not a ton of cases that came into contact that I saw, but definitely some. You see complaints about local residents who have been kicked out of their homes to make way for evacuees, and there's a few letters that I saw, but they write these letters to authorities, saying, why have we been punished? I never did anything wrong, but now I've been kicked out of my home to make way for this evacuee. And the issue was that there were a lot of very elite institutions coming from Leningrad and Moscow, very kind of elite members of the society. The Writers' Union was evacuated, the Academy of Science was evacuated, and there was, though kind of organization was poor, there was certainly a sense that these institutions and these members of society really needed to be provided for, which meant that which meant making room and sort of sending other people out, and that certainly that situation of forcing local residents to leave to make way obviously did not help create positive relations between these two groups. Right, and I think one of the documents I looked at from Kazakhstan kind of made the point that evacuation should be seen as an opportunity to sort of kick out problematic elements from the cities, but in fact what was happening was that evacuees were seen as the problematic elements on the ground, so this was creating some problems. What you described in terms of the ministries also is actually happening with cultural institutions. So you have, I believe the case that there was a dissertation written specifically on cultural institutions in Russian that discusses this. You have theaters being, again, moved from Moscow and Leningrad to the east, and then kicking out the local troupe or trying to coexist with the local troupe in one building, which creates a lot of hierarchical problems, and the Moscow guys are considered the big names, but then the locals feel like they've been they're now being shafted and ignored and sent out to the village. And this creates kind of really problematic kind of responses in terms of on the official level. For example, Kazakhstan, the Republican authorities are very excited to get these higher level cadres. So all the film studios were evacuated to Kazakhstan. All of a sudden, Almaty becomes the center of film production in the Soviet Union. That's where Ivan the Great film was filmed, I believe, by oh my God, Eisenstein. Eisenstein was there. He's in Kazakhstan. He's also, I believe, in Uzbekistan. But basically, all the film guys are in Uzbekistan, and the Republican authorities are interested to have these cultural figures. They're interested to have the scientists there, because some of the institutes of the Academy of Sciences are also end up in Almaty. A lot of them end up in Tashkent, but they go to different places. And they're really encouraging these people to work on local projects. And they're pushing the film guys to make films about Kazakhstan. Scientists are working on sort of projects that are related to Kazakhstans. They're interested in having them train local cadres to really bring up the level of culture and science in these places. And what you have, for example, in 1943, it's still the war, but a lot of the areas where there were large concentrations of evacuees started feeling to have branches of the Academy of Sciences set up at at those cities. So you see how the kind of the presence of these prominent figures impacts local communities. But the authorities are interested in promoting this and are interested in having this leave a trace. At the same time, on the kind of interpersonal level, the local people feel stunted. The Academy of Science people arrive in Almaty, and the local guy says, "Well, we have academics here too. We don't need you guys," because they feel like they're going to be sort of overlooked now that these more prominent figures are there. So it creates sort of an ambivalent. It generates these sort of ambivalent reactions at different levels of at different levels of governance.
Well, we are already at 2 o'clock, so thank you very much again.
Thank you for your time.